Welcome back, everyone, to session 6. The topic is operant behavior. In this session, we're going to talk about a different kind of behavior, very different than respondent behavior. Recall in respondent behavior that we were talking about a specific kind of response that happens as a result of stimuli that precede the response. In this situation, we're usually talking about stimulus response theory, SR theory, in which stimuli come to control the behavior, and through the respondent conditioning, new stimuli that were previously neutral now come to control that same response. In operant behavior, we're going to be learning about something entirely different, in which we see not only that new stimuli can come to control behavior, but the emergence of new behavior could happen. And we're going to be talking about the work of Thorndike and Skinner and comparing and contrasting operant behavior to those kinds of responses that we talked about in the previous sections on respondent behavior. Make sure you go ahead and have your PowerPoint ready, and I'll go ahead and freeze the camera. Okay, let me get my pointer turned on, and we are set. All right, so we begin our discussion with the work of Thorndike, whose work in 1898, Animal Intelligence, described a series of experiments with cats that he studied problem-solving behavior. This is a picture of Thorndike, and this is a picture of Thorndike's puzzle box. And in this situation, he would take a cat who has not eaten food for a couple of hours and place it in this box. And on the outside of the box was a plate of sardines or tuna fish or something along those lines, so that when the cat was able to get out of the box, it confronted something that was waiting for him or her, a plate of fish, to, in a sense, reinforce the behavior of getting out of the box. Now, in this box, there were several ways to actually get out. One way is that you could step on this treadle over here, which would open up the door. You could fiddle with the latch here with your paw and open up the door. There's also a way that you could pull this screen off the top up here, which would allow the cat to jump out. Okay. And what Thorndike noticed in repeating this over and over again is that when you take the cat and place it in the box, and here what we're looking at is the very first trial for cat 12. It took the cat approximately 150 seconds to get out of the box to solve the problem. On the bottom x-axis, we see plotted the number of trials, and you could see consecutive trials from 1 to 25. And here are the number of seconds it took for the cat to get out. On trial number 2, the cat got out certainly much quicker, got out maybe in 30 seconds. Then the next time took about 75 seconds. The next time, perhaps 60 seconds. And then from that point on, it appears that the cat gets in the box and almost seemingly gets out of the box instantaneously. That is, although you do see some variability here, what you generally see is, for the most part, a downward trend, which is certainly less than what you saw up here. And the way Thorndike had described this phenomenon is that at this point here, these first 4 or 5 trials, the cat is engaged in trial and error learning. But then from this point on, it appears that once the cat gets into the box, the cat's getting out of the box as quickly as possible, as if the cat now has purposeful kind of behavior. And there does not seem to be much more room for improvement in the rate or speed at which the cat is able to get out of the box, because you can see that there's very quicker movements don't happen as they did up here. Okay, so what we look at here is actually the slope of the line. And when we see the slope of the line go like this is a learning curve. Okay, a nice learning curve. Now we could certainly see that other rats would generate a different kind of learning curve. Perhaps cat number 10 or 9 or 8 might actually take longer to generate a learning curve. Maybe one of the other cats did not have this kind of a transition and only had 2 trials. And then from that point on, the cat was able to get out of the box much quicker. So the way Thorndike, and pardon me for going back to the original slide, Thorndike looked at this phenomenon and described this as the law of effect, in which he said that responses can be made more probable, in this case, the response of a cat getting out of a box, and can be made more probable by providing a consequence outside of that box. In these instances, every time the cat got out of the box, the cat found food. And he believed that it was this consequence of getting out of the box and finding food was the thing that made the response more probable. Okay? He also reasoned that if it works that some consequences can make a response more probable, then there are certainly other responses that can make, or consequences that can make responding less probable. In these instances in which responses became more probable, he said that these were called satisfiers, and that the stimuli were called satisfiers. In this case, tuna fish or sardines to a hungry cat is a satisfier. And when the cat is confronted by the satisfier, the behavior is stamped into their repertoire. In other instances, the cat may actually have an annoying effect, and then the response might be stamped out. That is, the cat gets out of the box, runs over to the dish, and there is nothing in the dish. Okay, I suppose to a hungry cat, that could be pretty annoying. And if we do this again and again and again, the cat gets out of the box, runs over to the plate, and doesn't find food there, after a period of time, the behavior starts to decrease. That is, the cat's getting out of the box frequency gets less and less and less. And we see that the getting out of the box response is stamped out. And these are actually the terms that Thorndike had used. So now let's go ahead and move ahead to the work of Skinner. In 1938, Skinner's book Behavior of Organisms was written, in which he described what would be the experimental analysis of behavior, in which the study of animals, single subjects, were studied under very controlled conditions for longer periods of time. And his philosophy was that behavior could be studied for the sake of studying behavior without assuming anything about behavior, that we would be able to set up conditions to study any organism under controlled conditions and learn a great deal without saying anything else about the behavior except the responses that you're studying. Now, one of the things that he early on had discovered in operant behavior was that it was very closely tied to the work that Darwin was talking about. That is, in Skinner's research, he had written that a large portion of an organism's repertoire is acquired in the lifetime of that organism, something that he came to call ontogenic selection. That is, these are the selective pressures that organisms are exposed to once they are born, which exert control over behavior and come to shape behavior until the animal acquires the behavior or no longer emits that particular behavior. He found that that same philosophy was true with phylogenetic selection. In this situation, and this is primarily what Darwin was referring to, was that a species can be selected over hundreds, thousands, millions of years based on particular morphological features. And if those animals have certain morphological features that they're able to survive longer to the age of reproduction, then the chances are the offspring of those animals would also similarly have those same morphological features, and therefore they may be able to survive as well. However, what worked for the parents might not work very well for the offspring. Now, within any distribution of selection, you're going to have variation in genetics and morphological features, so that as environments changed, either behaviors or certain features of the animal changed, certain things that animals were able to do based on changes in structure, and they were able to survive and reproduce. Those that didn't simply were not able to reproduce, and they did not pass on their genes. So this is the phenomenon that Darwin was referring to, phylogenetic selection, in which it's the selection of a species over thousands and thousands of years. And in comparison and contrast to what Skinner was talking about, The same sort of selection process is happening. The only difference really is that we're looking at a different time scale. This is across thousands of years. This is across and within the lifetime of the organism. And he is able to identify that we usually see three types of selection going on, or what he called three levels of selection. That is the selective pressures that determine genetics, the selective pressures that will determine operant behavior, and then finally, the selective pressures that select out cultural practices by a particular society, by individuals in that society that engage in operant behaviors that are also heavily influenced by genetics as well. We're going to come later on and talk about cultural selection in the section when we get to, let me find it here in my syllabus. We get to that probably on session 26 when we get to cultural analysis. So let's move on. Here's a picture of Skinner. And talk about the definition of an operant. Now, Skinner was very careful about this, and the idea of a class of responses is something that you will come to appreciate as you study behavior analysis. You will certainly come to appreciate it when you come to read about the functional analysis of behavior. Certainly if you have read chapter 2 in Pearson Cheney, where they talked about classes of stimuli, classes of responses. These were very, very important concepts in the development of the experimental analysis of behavior. So a class of responses, an operant is a class of responses, all of which operate on the environment to produce a similar effect. That is, the operant is considered a functional unit of behavior that is defined by its consequence on the environment. What do we mean by this? And I believe that they go through this same sort of an example in Pearson Cheney of simply opening a door. If you note here, there are many ways in which a person could open up a door. We could certainly turn a knob, push the door open, pull the door open. We could step on an electronic mat, the door opens up automatically, like when we go to the supermarket. We have remote controls that we could actually push using our thumb to open up a door. Some actually doors open based on not stepping on a pad, but motion detectors. Okay, we could slide glass doors open. We could, if we're carrying something and we come to a door and we can't go through it forward, we could kind of turn our back on it and use our hip or our rump and kind of push through the door like waitstaff do at restaurants. So there are many, many different ways in which we could actually open a door. And certainly one other way to open a door is to turn to somebody whose hands are free and you say, could you please open the door? And the door opens because you're the speaker and the person who was listening was predisposed to do you a favor by opening up a door. Now, in all of these instances, it becomes very clear that if we're going to look at all of the morphological structures involved in opening a door, there are many different muscles and joints and bones and so forth that are used to emit this particular response. Many ways to open a door. But the thing that Skinner pointed out here is that even though all the ways we defined opening a door may be different based on the form, or what he called the topography, it's very clear that whatever you do, it all has the same effect. The door opens up. And it's that feature that defines it as an operant. Not on the fact that you pushed this time, you pulled this time, you used this, or you used a remote control. The idea here is that the door opening, the response that opens the door becomes the reinforced response. It's opening a door. It doesn't matter necessarily the form of the response. The key thing here is that the response results in the door opening. And that's what defines the operant of opening up a door. Now we're going to go through some distinctions here, and we will continue to come back to these distinctions between operant and respondents. First of all, we say that operants are emitted. And the word emitted was chosen by Skinner for very good reasons, and it takes a long time to really appreciate just how important that word really is. We're going to come back and talk about that in the very last class. But for right now, let's go ahead and define that operant behaviors are emitted, which literally means that operant behavior appears to be literally given off. Okay, whereas we said that respondents are elicited, or which means to be pulled out of the organism. Here what it appears to refer to is the fact that There's a much more mechanistic kind of relationship that we see in respondent behavior of stimulus response. It's almost as if the stimulus crosses threshold, and now it will elicit a response and literally pull the response out of the organism. It pulls tears from your eyes when dirt gets into your eyes. It appears that your leg is pulled up when you tap your patellar tendon in a knee jerk. In that situation, these seem to be uncontrollable behaviors, as if it's being literally pulled out of the organism beyond their control. Operants don't necessarily always have stimuli present when they are actually given off in the same way as we see with respondents. That's why these responses seem to be given off by the organism. Sometimes they're in the presence of very clear discriminative stimuli, and sometimes they're not necessarily as conspicuous, those stimuli. It's important to note here that we say that behavior actually happens. It is not that behavior is had. We don't say that the organism has a behavior. It is more appropriate to say that the organism emits a behavior. It's given off. And it's also very important to note here that behavior is not stored. Behavior is emitted. In the same sense as that when you look at a light that's turned on, like a light bulb, and you switch the light on, light is actually being emitted from the light bulb, from those fibers and the objects that filaments that make the light actually operate. When we turn the light off, that is, we hit the switch, we say that the light is no longer being emitted. There's no more activity there that's stimulating the contents of the light bulb. We don't say that the light, when the light is turned off, that the light is stored, waiting in the light bulb, waiting for somebody to come along and turn it on. We don't talk about it in those terms. We just simply say that light is on 1 second, it's being emitted. The next second, we turn the power off, and light is no longer being emitted. We say the same thing happens with behavior as well, in the sense that when behavior happens under specific circumstances. When behavior is not happening, we don't say that that behavior, that operant behavior, is being stored in the organism waiting to come out. We just simply say it is no longer being emitted. Now, these words will become very important as we come to talk about many more complex behaviors, particularly when we talk about things such as memory. But for right now, we're going to make the clear distinction simply that respondents are elicited, right? Operants are emitted. The second feature, we note that operants are modifiable by environmental consequences. That is, you could change the probability of operants being given off by arranging different kinds of consequences. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Thorndike was getting at when he talked about satisfiers in the law of effect. That is, the behavior of the cat in the box was modifiable based on the consequences of the cat getting out of the box and coming across and finding food as a reinforcer. In respondent behavior, respondents are not modifiable by environmental consequences. That is, if I give you $100 and say, if I tap your patellar tendon and you don't raise your leg, I'll give you $1,000 or $100 or even $1. You really can't change respondent behavior because these things will not change through consequences. It seems to be a different kind of behavior that we're talking about. Third, we note that operant conditioning adds new controlling stimuli and new responses to an organism's repertoire. And this is what we're going to talk about when we get into learning shortly. Respondent conditioning only adds new controlling stimuli. That is, in these instances with Pavlov's dog, at first, food powder, the unconditional stimulus, gave rise to the elicited response of the dog salivating. Now, through respondent conditioning, we could have a tone or a light or any of these other neutral stimuli come to now elicit the same kind of response. But it's still the dog is salivating. There's really not much difference in what the dog did to the food powder to what the dog is doing with the bell, although we may find maybe minute differences in that behavior. But we're really not talking about anything remarkably new that the dog is doing or anybody else is doing for that matter with respondent behavior. With operant conditioning, however, not only are we going to have new stimuli controlling behavior, but now we build new behavior into an organism's repertoire. In that sense, it is different than respondent conditioning and respondent behavior. Most operant behavior involves the activity of striated muscles. That is, these are the muscles along bones and joints that allow us to move bones and joints around so that we can actually execute and move things in the environment. Not only move ourselves in the environment, but more importantly, manipulate and operate directly on the environment. Again, operants refer to the fact that we operate on our environment to produce changes, and those changes are very important and influence what happens in the future of our behaviors. Responsive behaviors also involve muscles, but they didn't involve striated muscles along the bones. These actually involve more smooth muscles and glands activities, the main things that we talk about when we're talking about the autonomic nervous system. Finally, operant behavior probabilities could be 1.0, but oftentimes they're less than 1.0. That is, when stimuli come along before operant behavior, or reinforcing stimuli or punishing stimuli happen after operant behavior, it changes and alters the probability behaviors from anywhere between 0 to 1.0. Okay? That is, they're oftentimes emitted in the presence of identifiable stimuli, but sometimes there are not identifiable stimuli when operant behavior is emitted. On the other hand, with responsive behavior, we see that the behavior is elicited, usually 1.0. That is, if that stimulus crosses threshold, you will have a response to the stimulus. If you tap the patellar tendon with enough force, there is a 1.0 probability you're going to get the elicited response of the knee jerk. The only way that's going to change is to alter the neurophysiology or to possibly give a drug, maybe like Curare might do something to knock that out. So we say that operant behavior is significant, and when we get to the next section, that's going to be clearly the case. Operant behavior really does shape the world around us. All the things that we are able to do as a species that we do, that all species do to operate on their environment, is operant behavior. However, we have to recognize an interesting twist. It seems like we operate on the world and control the world around us through operant conditioning. But as it turns out, its operant behavior itself is shaped and maintained and controlled through something that we call contingencies of reinforcement. We'll stop here, and I will come back and discuss